for his kind invitation. I mean, I'm really happy to be here, to have been able to meet most of you and seeing again some of others of you. And also would like to thank all the participants in organizing this meeting from the Institución Fernando Católico. César has been a great help. And particularly, I like to say that I'm extremely happy because it's the first time that I'm actually presenting in person since the COVID. So this makes it a more special occasion. My presentation today, as Javier mentioned, deals with the memory of Jewish and Muslim Spain, specifically how it was conceptualized in historiographical discourses during the period of the Spanish Restoration, the last decades of the 19th century, early 20th century. And of course, it will deal and relate to many of the things that have been discussed in the previous session, as you will soon see. But the sort of point of departure is this renewed attention that we can witness in the 19th century in Spain towards this Semitic past, right? This has been already commented, especially by Xavier, that we can account for this with different reasons. In the first place, the influence of modern European Orientalism that pours into Spain, but also a growing geopolitical interest in North Africa that even starts in the 18th century, and of course, accompanies all the 19th century and has its impact on these historiographical discourses. And for sure, the emergence of new sensibilities towards the phenomenon of culture that also comes back to the legacy of the Enlightenment, we can also discuss. But in any case, there is certainly a very specific or special configuration of these Orientalist studies in Spain. There is particularities that is widely recognized both by Spanish authors and by foreign Orientalists. And one of my arguments is that, and has been already noted before, the use of Spanish nationalism of these discourses, right, and these historiographical images. Starting from this, there is like a very complex process of appropriating this legacy that has its inconsistencies, its discrepancies, its difficulties, and it always involves this double process of incorporating of inclusion and exclusion of this past into what is conceived as the Spanish narrative, the national narrative, and so on, right? And because of that, there is always a permanent, very high degree of ambivalence in this attitude and in this position. Okay, we can pass. Can we make it big or it doesn't work?
No, it doesn't work for the people there in internet.
Okay. Well, so,
but you see, okay?
Yes.
I think this will be no problem, but then I have some quotations that are kind of long and I have slower case, so that it's okay. Let's please, Javier, switch to the next.
You did it with my presentation also. I mean, we had to pick my presentation.
Yeah, I know, but now I don't know what happens. I cannot do it today. I don't know why. The mysteries of internet and computer. They decide not to share the screen. Sorry. Sorry.
No, don't worry. I hope you can read. If not, I also try to read these quotations, and I have always put the double translation, English and Spanish versions. In any case, what I would like to highlight is that within this nationalist instrumentalization of historiography and Orientalism, there are two most conspicuous aspects, in my opinion. In the first place, Orientalism became a tool for the very knowledge of the real Spain, which of course is the one that has to deal with the Catholic or the Christian kingdoms that and then the continuation. I mean, Spain was considered to be the continuator of these kingdoms that triumphantly perform the Reconquista and succeed in expelling the Moors and also expelling the Jews from Spain. But besides this tool, as an auxiliary tool for the understanding of Spanish history, Orientalism also opened a clear debate on the relation of these legacies, of these Semitic legacies, to what can be called the Spanish cultural heritage. No? And so this opened this this debate, how it belongs, how it relates to modern Spaniards, which impact does it have for the formation of Spanish culture, right? And in this way, for example, Pascual de Gallangos presented the importance and the task of the Arabists to some of his students in Madrid in the 1850s, as here you have the quotation both in Spanish and in English, that solving the interesting problem of how much and in which fashion did the arrival of the Arabs to our peninsula contribute to the shaping of modern European civilization. So what does it tell us about ourselves, about the national self, but also can we use it to highlight the importance of Spanish culture or the development of the general European civilization? So there's also this nationalist argument of trying to appropriate this for the salvamiento, for highlighting the positive aspects of Spanish culture, right? We can move forward. And I want to point that since the mid, or even since the beginning of the 19th century, the Royal Academy of History will play a central role in the development of Spanish Orientalism. And in particular, during the Restoration period, starting in 1875, this will grant a very specific character to these studies, which is for the most part attached to a certain liberal conservative understanding of the national history that's been already presented by Xavier and by Juan Pablo. In this sense, it only constitutes a continuation of this analysis. As I mentioned, there is this general debate how this relates to the Spanish nation, right? Orientalism, for the most part, as I mentioned, is configured as auxiliary science, but this also has to deal with a desire to professionalize historiography, historical research, and Arabism becomes one of these tools for making a more modern historical approach to the Spanish past, importing methods of investigation from abroad, and in this sense, Orientalism also, and Arabism in particular, will become more professional, a more professional task, a more professional profession, and the paradigm of this kind of new approach, more positivist in a way, will be Francisco Codera, Arabic teacher first here in the University of Zaragoza. Like most of his students, we can see this parallel process of Arabics that are formed in Zaragoza and later became professors in Madrid. And he will definitely be the most important scholar in the Orientalist field in the late 19th century, and will create a school. And most of the most important Arabics later on will be known as the Arabic School of Codera. So they're highlighting the position of Codera. He began the publication of the Biblioteca Arabic Hispana, an effort to translate to Spanish some of what they consider the most important Arabic sources that we can use for understanding the history of Al-Andalus, and in this sense also to give us clues about the history of the Christian kingdoms that had relations with Al-Andalus, most of the time in wars, but also in cultural exchange, right? And we can see definitely a conservative turn of this Orientalist field. I mean, in the early 19th century, you can say that Arabism was also instrumentalized by more liberal progressive authors, in the case perhaps of José Antonio Conde, which attached his interest to the history of the defeated, as he pointed. I mean, he's interested in telling the history of Spain from the side of the defeated Muslims, for example. And in his interpretation of this legacy, is very, very linked to his own vision, liberal vision for the Spanish history, and his anti-clerical, in the first place, his anti-clerical positions, right? But we will see that this turns on as, in a way, this parallels the general conservative shift in many ways of Spanish culture and Spanish nationalism, I will argue, in the second half of the 19th century. And for example, we have a very important discourse by Vicente de la Fuente, a very conservative historian, specialized in ecclesiastical history, that in a meeting of the Royal Academy of History described the Arabic scholars as this brioso squadron, a vigorous squad that tramples, topples, and destroys everything that it finds in its path, coming to substitute the clerical and monastic history of Spain, with the narrations of the worshippers of the Quran. So the Arab school is a serious threat to the real Catholic sense of the Spanish nation. And I think he refers with this quotation to the early school of José Antonio Conde and some of his followers, whereas he saw that there has been, luckily, a change, and Spain could come now with distinguidos arabistas y a la vez buenos católicos. Like we have now, by the end of the century, distinguished scholars that can deal with Arabic sources, but that are at the same time good Catholics, and they don't present this threat that once Arabism had for the correct understanding of Spanish history, right? And he, I think, clearly points out to, for example, Codera, who was present in the Royal Academy at the time, and others, colleagues. We can move forward, Javier, please. So there is also a big debate in this period that relates also to how this research has to be done and how you have to reconstruct the history of Al-Andalus. And this debate relates to what was termed in the period as the debate between the external history and internal history. It's a very common epithets that are used in the general field of history. It not only relates to this Orientalist field, but in general, external history, we can say that is what we today will understand as political history, trying to find documents and try to clearly establish the different periods, the different reigns, the different monarchs, different sultans, the caliphate, the Taifas periods, and so on. So there was this need to really assert what are the different chronologies, and we have to focus on the kind of sources that will give us information about, different political associations, political realms, and so on. And once this is a Codera's program. I mean, clearly, like we have to focus. I mean, both external history and internal history, which will relate with cultural history, philosophical history, history of literature. That's very interesting. We have to go to there, but yet we're not ready. We have to focus solely in the external history of Al-Andalus, and in a later period, a different generation of Arabs will be able to really investigate with all the due clarity and the professionalism the cultural history, what was termed as internal history. This begins with his disciples. I mean, Julián Rivera, I think we can argue that Julián Rivera is the one that opens a more professional a more professional approach to the study of the internal history of Al-Andalus. And he does so, first of all, with a study of educational institutions of Islam. This has to do also with the context of the preoccupation with education that relates also to this sense of decadence that is very, very conspicuous in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, and will be even more after the crisis of '98, if you're familiar with this context. So in a way, Arabic scholarship will get entangled with these discourses on regeneration, education, and so on. And Julián Rivera is the one who moves Arabs in this sense and entangles with these concerns. And he claimed to be interested in this sense in estudiar el espíritu que mostró nuestra raza en la enseñanza de las ciencias y las artes dentro de una civilización tan distinta de la cristiana. You have also the English quote. Important here to say that he's already speaking of our race in a different civilization, right? Okay, so we can definitely see that with this shift opened by Rivera, we'll have Arab scholars that participate in a clearly conservative, liberal conservative, if you wish, but in a conservative space of regenerationism think and thought, excuse me, which is in a way very, very preoccupied with issues such as modernization of historical research, improving of education, and so on, but always from these liberal conservative positions that also give paramount importance to Catholicism in the Spanish public sphere. In this sense, they will be completely attached and committed to a program and an agenda for regeneration that has to pass through the vindication of the national tradition. There is this despair with the national culture, especially after '98 and the loss of the last colonies, and it becomes sort of a common currency to discredit Spanish culture and even to disqualify the capacity of the Spanish for intellectual and cultural production. There is generalized this idea that the Spanish are not only in decadence, but they they have been unable for centuries to produce anything of intellectual value, in part because of this issue of the leyenda negra that has been internalized, that because of the intolerance, like the Spanish minds have been sort of kidnapped, and nothing positive can come from these mentalities. And definitely this conservative regenerationism and the Arabists that are linked to it will have their caballo de batalla. The main issue will be to combat this image of this incapacity of the Spaniards to produce intellectual products. But this also is sort of transversal, and the different groups will participate in this kind of new vindication of intellectual tradition, and can be also reaffirmed from more liberal or purely liberal positions, such as, for example, Rafael de Altamira, which has a very similar approach. I mean, first of all, we need to stop vilifying our own tradition, our intellectual tradition, and we have to base our new sense of Spain on the understanding that we also contribute to the European culture in a noteworthy manner, right? In this sense, the Arabists, despite their very Catholic allegiances, they will collaborate with other liberal authors in this new agenda, but they will do so very, very close to positions like those of Menéndez Pelayo that have been discussed also in the previous session. But they will have these different collaborations. I mean, for example, they will be, especially Julián Rivera, and also I will speak of Miguel Palacios, from Zaragoza. In a first moment, they will create a new magazine, a new journal in 1900 exactly, called Revista Dragón, which promotes this conservative regenerationism and will be very influential all over Spain, and especially even more in 1906, I think, that they found a new journal after they moved to Madrid. They will put an end to this publication of Revista Dragón, which had a more local dimension, and they will found a very influential journal, Cultura Española, which will come with the participation of scholars from different leanings, including Rafael Altamira. Will have a predominance of liberal conservatives, but will be open to different positions as well. And in this sense, they are at the forefront of this liberal conservative cultural regeneration project from Madrid. I want to, please, let's move to the next slide. And I want to really highlight two central issues that, in my opinion, mediated, have a great impact in how Orientalism developed, and also in contributing to point some of the interests that these researchers are trying to achieve with their studies. In a way, I already spoke of this vindication of the Spanish intellectual tradition, and I will comment right now. But I want also to point that a growing preoccupation with the possibility of a Catholic science is always on the background, specifically with these Arabists from Zaragoza. I will comment on that later on. Now I want to specify this issue of the vindication of the Spanish intellectual tradition that is supported under the great Menéndez Pelayo, which is the leading figure in this sense, and the support that he will provide to these scholars of the Arab school. In this sense, they will align themselves. I mean, Menéndez Pelayo for sure, his main works will adhere to both these issues, to the vindication of the Spanish tradition and to the defense of a Catholic approach to science in the base of the philosophy of science at the moment. There will be tensions between both of them, but there is a program that is clearly oriented to these goals. In this sense, the Arabists will establish very important relations with scholars and other Catholic figures in Europe that are creating a transnational network and movement for the defense of Catholic science, with the approval of the papacy of Leo XIII, and certainly with the interest in reviving scholasticism as sort of the official philosophy of the Vatican and of Catholic culture in general. I want to point the participation already at a very early stage in 1899 of both Julián Rivera and Miguel Palacios, which is a disciple of Rivera, a colleague to some extent as well in Zaragoza, and both of them will also meet again in Madrid. a few years later, but in 1899, they participate in a tribute volume that is offered to Menéndez Pelayo, in my opinion, just because of the situation after the crisis and this sense of cultural crisis. And they want to promote this idea that the Spanish tradition is not worthy. And this, of course, is a very specific context, but it echoes some polemics that they were raging on since the 1870s. And what is known, I don't know if you're familiar with the polemic of the Spanish science that follow after a series of exchanges in some journals debating this issue, the contribution, the intellectual contribution in Spain. There were like liberal authors saying that we don't have any substantial or any important philosophers, for example. And Menéndez Pelayo became famous exactly in this period as a very young scholar, very enthusiastic defending the national tradition. So in this new context of the post-98, this issue of the polemic of the Spanish science comes again to the forefront. And it's very conspicuous in this tribute volume to Menéndez Pelayo, the preface of which was written by Juan Valera, mentioned by Juan Pablo before. And he claimed, as in the line that I was presenting, that the situation demanded to stop vilifying the Spanish tradition and, first of all, marcar sin vaguedades, sin exageraciones. Well, I read the English version for the sake of understanding, determining without vagueness and without hesitation our importance in the history of human thought, and to mark the position that we deserve within the concert of the civilizing nations. Again, trying to indicate what the Spaniards have contributed to the European nation and stop despairing about our national culture. Let's switch, please, Javier. Thank you so much. In this sense, I want also to speak of some transnational contacts and influences that will be very, very, very critical for these developments. In the first place, the Arabists also have very, very noteworthy contacts with Arabists and European Orientalists, but I want to focus now on the influence of a series of Jewish historians and the development of modern Jewish historiography, first and foremost in Germany. But with the creation of this school, that I'm afraid, Olaf, that I'll try my best, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, so literally the science of Judaism, which was a project designed and, in a way, a direct inheritance of the Jewish Enlightenment of the Haskalah of the 18th century. It grows in the first half of the 19th century with the clear desire to also promote and to also highlight the importance of Jewish culture and contribution to general development of European culture, with a very open program for the integration and assimilation of Jews in different European nations, first and foremost again in Germany, but will be highly influential for Jewish historians in France, even in the UK. I mean, it will be served by very different scholars. In this sense, it's critical the reception of one of these scholars, Salomon Munk. I have here the picture, a German historian, a Jewish German historian, studied under Hegel, I think in Berlin for some time at the early 19th century, and he became very dissatisfied with the presentation in German works, Hegel, but others as well, in the work of the history of philosophy, in which there was no mention at all of the contribution of Jewish and Muslims, by the way. I mean, Salomon Munk always integrates both Jewish and Muslim philosophy into his arguments, but the issue is there has not been any recognitions of medieval Jewish philosophy, of medieval Muslim philosophy to this trajectory of thought that Hegel presented in his history of philosophy, right? I mean, for Hegel, the Jewish race was very important in creating monotheism in ancient times, but that was it. Once they created monotheism, Christianity assumed this religious idea and develops to a next stage, and we can just forget about Jews and so on, right? So Salomon Munk was attacking this view, and he really made his case, became a very influential Orientalist scholar in France, because he didn't have the chance to get a permanent position in Germany and had to go to France, move to France, and eventually succeeded Ernest Renan, I think, in the Collège de France. So he became an important figure. And what will be I mean, Menéndez Pelayo will be fascinated by the works of Munk. He constantly refers to him in some of his works. And he adapts on some of Munk's views, and especially the importance of highlighting the influence of Jewish and Muslim philosophers for the development of scholasticism. In a way, Salomon Munk was inviting Catholic scholars to pay attention to this cultural exchange that happened in the medieval period, and succeeded in that. Menez Pelayo will read that and will integrate it into the Spanish discussions, in my view. And through this, reading of Munk will favor a patrimonialization of the Jewish and Muslim legacy that was already on, that will get a new turn under this approach. This also coincides with a period, please, the next slide. Oh, sorry, I wanted to mention just a very interesting quote. Joseph Jacobs was a British historian, I think from Australia originally, but he was established in London and became a correspondent of the Royal Academy of History from London. And he made a trip to Spain trying to find information in different archives of the Jewish Iberian past, and was invited to deliver a speech, and also became a correspondent of the Academy. And he went to the Royal Academy and he offered this speech, and later came as a text in the bulletin of the Royal Academy. It's explaining to the Spanish scholars the different stages in the formation of a new modern Jewish historiography, dealing with this idea. He also highlights the centrality that for modern European Jewish historians, the Spanish period had, I mean, in their configuration of what is the role, that also has to be present in modern times. I mean, they have this Sephardic myth, as it has been branded by some scholars in the latest years. The Sephardic history was especially relevant for Jews because specifically, mostly under the Muslims, but not only, also in Christian kingdoms, they were allowed to really flourish. I mean, they were integrated, and because they were allowed to be integrated into the general culture, into the majority culture, they really flourished, and they produced high literature, high scientific productions, and this was for the benefit not only of the Jews themselves, but also of the majority culture. So in this way, they were prefiguring a model for the interactions in the modern period. I mean, the Jews should be emancipated, and with this, everybody will gain, not only the Jewish minority, but also the German state, the French state, and so on. With this image of the importance of the Sephardic past, Jacobs tried to explain and convey that to the Spanish scholars present in this meeting, and he says, we, Judíos Europeos, and we European Jews, keep our gaze fixed upon you, the wise thinkers and writers of Spain, as a part of the history of the Jews, and in truth, the richest and supremely interesting part can only be studied in the Iberian Peninsula. And he goes on and on. He expressed his hope that at some point there will be Spaniards who will also be Jewish as well, and will be the guardians of this wonderful legacy. But in the meantime, is the responsibility of the Spanish Catholic historians to investigate and contribute, and it's an invitation certainly to participate in this new modern Jewish historiography. I think just it's a relevant quotation. Yeah, we can move forward, please. So we see that this, as paradoxical as it might happen, or it can seem, there is this convergence with all the limitations. I mean, from different approaches and from different perspectives, but between Spanish conservative liberals such as Menendez Pelayo and some European Jewish scholars such as Munk, there is this desire to vindicate from different positions, but there is the common desire to vindicate the Jewish intellectual legacy. Once for trying to demonstrate that Spain had offered so much to European culture, from the other side that Europe, the Jews in general have offered so much to European culture, but there is a certain convergence. In this sense, I want to point also a sentence from Menendez Pelayo in 1900. What is urgent today is to put at the hands of the scholars the principal documents in which the wisdom and thought of our elder is deposited, whether they were Gentiles, Jews, Moors, or Christians. Use the sun of science illuminated all. So first of all, let's try to amass all this information and celebrate and so on. This is integrated by the Arabists, and there is a clear agenda in this sense. It began, as I mentioned, with Julian Rivera's interest in the educational institutions in the Muslim world. And then at some point he identifies, he first focused on Al-Andalus, but then he widened his investigation and was very interested in what is the different changes in education in the Muslim world during the medieval period. And he comes with a clear argument that he identifies an influx of Christian Oriental sects into general Muslim culture in the periods of the 10th and 11th century. This is a very complex historical survey that he makes. I don't want to make it extremely difficult, but what he identifies is that Christian Oriental sects, such as the Nestorians, the Chaldeans, and so on, gave the basis for the later flourishing of Muslim philosophy. I mean, what is so important of Muslim philosophy is not so much indigenous to the Muslim tradition, but an influx of Eastern Christianity. So, on this basis, Rivera affirmed that there has existed a series of philosophical exchanges that connected the Eastern Christian world with the development of Western scholasticism in the later medieval centuries. So we can see that through the mediation of Muslim Antiguous philosophers, la vida monástica de los musulmanes, the monastic life of the Muslims, and the rules of their religious orders derive from the Christian forms of the Oriental rites. And therefore, it is possible to identify the links in the chain that ties all these traditions. So we can see several layers of multicultural contacts and exchanges that goes from the East, originating in the 10th century, to Muslim Spain, and from there, especially through the mediation of Jews, to Western Europe, and with a very, very important impact for the flourishing and the development of scholasticism. So, we can move forward. They will, both Rivera and Miguel Palacios, in this text that I was speaking of 1899, they will take Lull, the philosopher, theologian from Mallorca, as a paradigmatic case of this cultural context. I mean, and this, I think, begins. I don't have it I haven't decided who influenced who, but I think there is a strong influence of Menéndez Pelayo on the Arabics, might be otherwise. But I think Menéndez Pelayo was already pointed that Jules was not a normal scholastic thinker. I mean, he was a thinker that owed so much to the East. So perhaps like this interest of Menéndez Pelayo was conveyed to the Arabics, and they focus on these Oriental borrowings that you can appreciate in the work of Lull, and they make it explicit in this text. So Rivera, for example, went to the extent to say that Jules was none other than a Christian Sufi, talking about these mixtures. And he pointed to Ibn Arabi, the Murcian mystical thinker, as the seminal influence in the works of Lull. Even went to say that this influence of Arabi in Lull could be considered as the point of departure for a specific Spanish mysticism that will continue later on under Christian authors, right? So the point of departure of the Christian Spanish mystics goes to this moment. As Palacios continued what his master Rivera had initiated, and pointed that the great merit of Lull was to introduce into the stream of medieval Christian ideas, purified of its Muslim additives, something that perhaps was nothing else than a Muslim transformation of ancient Christian philosophy. Again, pointing to the Christian roots that we can find in the East. And in this way, Alcin Palacios, we can see the picture, had been ordered as a priest. He was a very Catholic person, a priest. As Catholic as you can get, I guess. And he justified all these investigations and all this research using an encyclical made by Leon XIII in 1879 called Aeternis Patris, which called for the, as I mentioned, the adhesion to scholasticism, to make scholasticism the official philosophy of modern Catholicism. And so, in this sense, Alcin claimed that just as Jules and other scholastic thinkers had not hesitated in using Arabs and Arab philosophy and adapt what they could find good in them and put it in the service of Christian dogmas, we should do the same in our days and try to vivify the works that in past centuries hicieron de España, they made Spain, the home of wisdom, la patria del saber. So there is this clear agenda of vindicating and pointing the Spanish side of these issues, and in a way Christianizing by pointing to the Oriental roots of this philosophy, right? He even went to evaluate positively the figure of Averroes, which have been widely been a very derogated figure for many Christian scholars because he was attached to religious hypocrisy or even to utter disbelief. And he, on the contrary, claimed that Averroes was not an Averroist, as usually was presented, and even pointed that Thomas Aquinas had been very, very importantly affected by the works of Averroes and has drawn from his works many of the arguments for his later Summa Theologica. I think we can move forward. So Averroes, on the contrary of the traditional view, had envisioned a middle course between religious irrationalism and irreligious rationalism that, in a way, represented a good solution for modern Catholics. I mean, in these conflictive approaches to the debates between modern science and religions, they were looking for this position that was claiming scholasticism as a model of looking for an understanding and an harmonic encounter between faith and reason. It's not anymore science versus religion, but faith and reason can be cultivated together. And in a way, they offer a new philosophy of science that is contrary to positivism, to materialism, and so on, and allow Catholic scholars that were, in a way, refrained from joining scientific positions and so on, and accept them and participate in this research. How I'm going with the time?
5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes. Okay, I think I will be okay. Perfect. So he pointed that Averroes, thanks to Averroes and through Aquinas' reading of Averroes, entró a la síntesis escolástica. It entered into the scholastic synthesis, incorporated, purged from its errors against the Christian faith, the copious stream of the philosophy and even the theology of Averroes. So, in a way, Aquinas cleaned all the negative aspect of the Muslim things that are irrelevant, but in a way provide this basis for this scholastic synthesis. His theology, Averroes' theology, was nothing else to some extent as an accommodation of Christian dogmas that originated in the Oriental Church and were adapted to the Islamic religions after an arduous and difficult gestation made possible by the efforts of Al-Ghazali in the Orient and by Ibn Tufayl and Averroes in our Spain. Again, like the importance of Spain in this chain of cultural contacts and the justification of making use of these Muslim philosophers, right? I think we can move forward. And this was a polemical argument, and certainly it was addressed to Catholic, very traditional audiences that were kind of surprised by these kind of conclusions of Asim Palacios. So there were priests and other Catholic scholars that tried to defend this kind of position. And we have, for example, the support of another colleague of Asim in Zaragoza, Juan Moneva y Puyol, another professor of law and canonical law, canon law, excuse me. And he claimed that also many people saw Arabist scholarship, as we saw before with Vicente de la Fuente a few decades earlier, that Arabist scholarship could be considered as an offense to the proper Catholic religion. The Orient, as Asim Palacios was showing, was imbued with the biblical spirit. So he has demonstrated that there were Muslim philosophers whose doctrine, for its more part, is Christian, is identical to ours. And he pointed that at a time, referring to these conflicts between science and religion, at a time when science and faith seems to be at odds, it was salutary and a welcoming issue to see in these medieval Muslim philosophers that there was no such contradiction between reason and faith. And Asim, therefore, can claim that those who are not Christians can, in fact, say truth of faith, not only historical truth, but like a truth of faith, right? I mean, it's a theological argument in a way. Within this context, what was also urgent and had not been done because of an imbalance of the development of Orientalism in favor of Arabist studies. I mean, there is also a parallel development of Hebraist studies and a renewed interest in Jewish Spain. But in the 19th century, in my opinion, doesn't reach the level of development and maturation and professionalization that the Arabist scholarship will achieve. So the Arabists became concerned with this situation, and they wanted to reinforce their views by saying we need to also see what is the role of the Jews in all these cultural changes. and we need to promote the studies of Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology as well. And we don't have anybody that is able to do that. Traditionally, Hebraist studies has teach in Spain biblical Hebrew, which was interested and was linked to the study of the Bible, but there was no proficient scholar in what was described as rabbinical Hebrew. I mean, there was nobody that was familiar with rabbinical sources and with all the development of rabbinical literature from ancient times to the medieval period and so on. But there is, under this agenda that in the first place was promoted by Menéndez Pelayo, this desire to understand the contribution of Jewish philosophers that live in the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, parting and departing from Salomon Munk's ideas, but this call for really make this knowledge available for Spanish scholars was taken by Adolfo Bonilla, the leading disciple, or one of the leading disciples of Menéndez Pelayo, who will be in line with Menéndez Pelayo's arguments with the need to defend and vindicate the Spanish intellectual tradition. And he ambitioned to write a very ambitious history of Spanish philosophy in several volumes. He published a first volume devoted to the ancient and Christian philosophy in the medieval period as well. The second volume and last, which it was, he had like a very, very ambitious project, but it only lasted 2 volumes. The second and last volume was devoted to Jewish philosophers, and he published this volume in 1912. And it's a very interesting work, full of genuine praise of Jewish thought and Jewish, and especially Iberian Jewish authors. But I just brought a couple of examples of this attitude by Bonilla, and especially what I'm trying to convey is this nationalization, this patrimonialization that is constant among different generation of Orientalist scholars from very different positions. What unites all of them is this Hispanization and vindication of the importance for the national tradition. He said that casi todo el desenvolvimiento intelectual de los judíos durante la Edad Media y principios de la modernidad es hispánico. And seeing that I didn't translate this one, I don't know why, I'm sorry. But he's claiming that most of the intellectual development of Jews during the medieval period was, in fact, Hispanic. So we have to make notice of that. And in a way, to the Jews, we can thank for giving Spain the name of the most, the home of wisdom, as in a way has pointed out before, like Spain became this home of wisdom, and all European scholars in the 12th, 13th, 14th century were coming to Spain to learn. I mean, this was thanks to the Jews and their cultural mediation. So we have so much to thank the Jews and Muslims for this importance, for allowing Spain to become a cultural protagonist in medieval Europe. I was mentioning, and just with this I will finish, that all these issues fomented and promoted the need to study rabbinical literature. There was no specialist in Spain, so eventually it was open a position, a new chair in the Madrid Universidad Central, and as well a new section in the Centro de Estudios Históricos, which I don't have time to express, but there was also a new institution created to try to promote the understanding of the Spanish history. And it was offered to a Jewish historian born in Jerusalem, and was making his career in Germany, Abraham Yahuda, and he will be invited to come to Spain and work in the framework of the Centro de Estudios Históricos, as well in the Universidad Central. And this will be a seminal moment. I cannot go more into depth with this, but it will be a seminal moment for the development of modern Jewish studies in Spain. It will have a great importance in my view. We can move, please. There were other factors that will be incorporated to this interest in nationalizing and incorporating the Semitic cultural legacy in Spanish national culture. I've been describing mostly the interest in philosophy and theology, but there will be a very remarkable interest in literary production. For example, we can just mention Ramón Menéndez Pidal, also influenced by Menéndez Pelayo in his interest of the Jewish romancero, as a series of popular poetry and compositions that he would work for many decades with this. Rivera was famous in the 1910s, specifically in 1912, with a very outstanding work. I mean, and a very, very revolutionary at the time study on the influence of Andalusi lyrical poetry to European lyrical poetry in general. But he put forward this argument that I have been discussing also with Juan Pablo these days to a great extent, that the Muslims really introduced with their conquest the religion in Spain, but they didn't really change the racial, if you want. But I mean, it's a very particular understanding of race in Rivera's, I think, but we can discuss that. It has many, many years, but eventually what is outstanding is that the Andalusians were Spaniards after all. First and foremost because of the race, by the language, and by many other questions. So they became Islamized, but you can trace a clear Spanish dimension that made them specific. And in this, he conveyed this image with the following quotation: Arab invaders. Okay, yeah, thanks. Well, you have the quotation there, and I just want to point to the last slide, which is sort of my conclusion, and try to bring this with the issue of tolerance and that is being debated these days. For example, Rafael de Altamira claimed in these debates that tolerance was as much as a Spanish feature as religious fanaticism. I mean, the medieval tolerance that he defended was as much as a Spanish feature than the religious fanaticism that was clearly characterizing the Spanish culture in later centuries. As seen, we can see that it's also pointing to the remarkable phenomenon of tolerance that can be appreciated in those medieval centuries, which many characterize as intolerant times. But we can see men consecrated to the study of philosophy, Muslim, Jews, and Christians. They lived together and they communicated peacefully in the pursuit of truth, right? I was going to speak a little bit of this image of Asim, but I don't have the time. But just want to finish with this comment of Isaac Fritzbayer, the great historian of the Jews in Christian Spain, with a very famous work in 1945. And he concluded his work sort of with this the idea that among the European countries, Christian Spain was at the same time the most fanatical and the most tolerant with regard to religion. I mean, he claimed that until the 14th century, the Jews have been living in better conditions in Spain than in many other countries, like in France and Germany. And you see this paradoxical and this very ambivalent situation of tolerance in Spain. I mean, there was a natural phenomenon, both fanaticism and tolerance in a country in which members of the three monotheist religions live side by side. It was not uncommon to find demonstration of true humanism and among the believers of the three religions in their daily life. My last sentence.
Oh, no.
What I want to convey is that ambivalence, in my opinion, is the most conspicuous element of all these historiographical interpretations in regard to the heritage and legacy of Muslim and Jewish Spain. However, under the double influence of these efforts to vindicate the Spanish cultural tradition and the defense of a position for Catholic science, liberal conservative scholars contributed to foster a positive image of the medieval tolerance and to celebrate the cultural production of the Iberian Jews and Muslims. These efforts were, of course, instrumentalized to serve many purposes and many national arguments in presenting concerns that they have. But nonetheless, I think they paved the way for at least a genuine appraisal of the Spanish Semitic heritage that had its positive continuation later on. So that's the main.
Vamos un poquillo flojo.
Sí, no. ¿Me quedo aquí o me bajo?
Sí, como quieras, te puedes quedar. Daniel, ¿estás ya ahí? ¿Nos escuchas?
Sí. ¿Me escucháis a mí?
¿Te
¿A mí se me escucha?
Se te escucha perfectamente.
Bien, bien.
Bien, mil gracias, qué bien. No sabía si ibas a aparecer como la Virgen.
Estoy, me he manifestado.
¿Se oye bien?
A ver.
¿Lo oís bien en la sala? Vale, okay. Then our last speaker is Daniel Munoz Sempere, who joins us via internet. He's Ramón y Cajal researcher at the University of Cádiz. His research topics include Spanish liberal exile in London and custom-based nationalism. Over and above this work, I would like to highlight his outstanding book, and this is why we are working together now, La Inquisición Española como tema literario, política, historia y ficción en la crisis del antiguo régimen. He is currently continuing with this line, this fascinating line of research by diving into the memory of the Inquisition in the Spanish 19th century. I give you the virtual floor. So many thanks.
Vale, gracias, Javier. Voy a presentar, voy a ver si se ve. No, perdón.
Se ha visto. Te pido que te ajustes al tiempo, aprovechando.
Sí, voy a intentar ser incluso, se puede ser más, lo más breve posible. Vale. Bueno.
Está viéndose ahora.
Vale, se ve y se ve cuando pasa de una a otra, ¿verdad?
Sí, correcto.
Bien. Okay, well, first, thanks, Javier, for having invited me to be here today. Also for being so accommodating in letting me speak online, and also allowing this last-minute change in topic. I was initially going to speak about a romantic historical novel, but I think that this current topic, the memory of the Spanish Inquisition and anti-clerical republicanism, is probably a bit more relevant, a bit more central to what this conference is about. So what I'm going to present, and I'm going to try and be very brief and maybe relate to the papers before me, which I found very exciting and very interesting, all of them, is part of a broad project on the literary image of the Spanish Inquisition. I am not a historian. I worked on Spanish literature. I have done some work previously on the literary image of the Spanish Inquisition during Enlightenment and Romanticism in Spain. So what I'm doing now is a projection of that, an extension into a later period. I look at how the Inquisition was deployed or used or revived in the history of ideas after its abolition, so in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Inquisition as a topic linked to wider debates, to wider controversies. If you like, the Inquisition as a vehicle of thought, a recurrent theme, a tradition of thinking about the Inquisition. So to make sense of all the literature that deals in one way or another with the Inquisition, I draw on ideas from a historian called Miguel Hué, who in the 1980s wrote an article about what he called the literatura inquisitorial, the inquisitorial literature. He starts from the point of a history of historiography, but he kind of widens the angle to include what he calls all those products of whatever literary genre that have used the historical argument to capture and disseminate a certain image of reality. And then he goes on saying that literary texts contributed perhaps more effectively than scientific history to the creation of diverse images of the Spanish Inquisition. So I draw from this, which is really about historiography, but I aim to include diverse texts, diverse manifestations of what you could call the inquisitorial theme. Very quickly, you can speak of several moments in the literature about the Inquisition in Spain. There's a first moment around the time of the abolition, all the debates on the abolition of the Inquisition in the courts of Cádiz, the ones moved by the Napoleonic abolition of the Inquisition. This is the time when the first histories of the Inquisition are written, the one by Llorente, as we know, started before he wrote the Historia Crítica de la Inquisición in French. He started by writing a Memoria Histórica on what had been the opinion of the Spaniards on the Inquisition. So the issue from the beginning was linked to the question of, was the nation in support of the Inquisition or not? Was the national opinion, or what then was seen as the national opinion, in favor of the Inquisition or against? There are other works by Antonio Puig-Blanch, also from the conservative, from traditionalist point of view, the defense, the apologia of the Inquisition by the philosopher Rancio. But also all this is having an echo on fiction, on works of fiction such as the novel Cornelia Bororquia, Víctima de la Inquisición, that inaugurates in Spain the tradition of anti-clerical Gothic images of the Inquisition. What I found interesting in this moment in the literature of the Inquisition is how there is a communication between both types of texts. What is being said in the Parliament, in the Cortes about the Inquisition, echoes the style, the images, the motifs that you can find in the Gothic novel, in the more sensationalist literature about the Inquisition. In the mid-century, the Inquisition has been abolished. After the First Carlist War, the specter of a reestablishment of the Inquisition is something that is in the past, and the Inquisition is written about as a chapter in national history. Again, Juan Pablo has talked about this, so I'm not going to stop much, but you have the Historia General de España by Modesto Lafuente, where the Inquisition is portrayed. Modesto Lafuente uses the image of a black cloud to speak about the establishment of the Inquisition. In the springtime of the nation, the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquest of Granada, the union of Castile and Aragon, all this kind of amazing moment where the nation is beginning, there is suddenly a black cloud, a nube negra, and that's the Inquisition. That appears as something that is central to the most glorious time in the nation, but also a motive of embarrassment to an extent. Modesto Lafuente saves Isabel la Católica, and he says that the establishment of the Inquisition was due to the misguided advice of the spiritual counselors, of the clergy. Yeah, and then you have Balmes, who more or less saves the Inquisition and speaks of how important it was for religious unity and so on. And Adolfo de Castro, his Historia de los Protestantes, where he attacks the Inquisition, he doesn't. He thinks that Isabel and Fernando had a fault in the establishment of the Inquisition, and he starts. One of the arguments that he uses against the Inquisition is something that I'm going to talk about today in relation to the text that I want to study, is that the Inquisition was a tool for to accaparate wealth for the church. Yeah, it was a tool for the confiscation of wealth. Now, when we reach the Restoration, and again, some of this has appeared before, but it's the time when I wanted to focus. During the Bourbon Restoration, the Inquisition is also a theme that recurs in different polemics, in different moments. The Ciencia Española and the Historia de los Ortodoxos in Pelayo. Benito Pérez Galdós, in his novels, deploys features of the Inquisition often, both from a historical novel point of view in El Audaz or La Segunda Casaca, when their characters were inquisitors in the last decades of the Inquisition, but also in the Torquemada novels. And Torquemada, in the novels of Galdós, is not an inquisitor, is a modern-day moneylender, and he burns the debtors. It's a figurative, symbolic use of the inquisitor, the image of the inquisitor that Galdós updates and revives and deploys in the context of the capitalist society. The conservative histories of the Inquisition by Ortiz Lara, by Capa. The Restoration is also the time when the history of the Inquisition by Henry Charles Lie, the first more or less scientific history of the Inquisition based on documentary evidence, is published. It wasn't translated into Spanish until a lot later. It's also a time when the archives of Inquisition start being open and catalogued, Paz y Melià's catalog of papers of Inquisition. And it's also a time when Juderías writes La Leyenda Negra, which I think is one of the discursive processes, conceptual movements or processes that is linked to the lineage of the Inquisition as a kind of wider preoccupation. And around these years, also something that is not here, the centennial commemorations of the Cortes de Cádiz also revived the theme of the Inquisition, because it's seen, the abolition of the Inquisition by the Cortes de Cádiz was seen as one of the most tangible outcomes of the Cortes. So when in 1912, the Cortes de Cádiz are memorialized, the Inquisition, the abolition of the Inquisition is an important topic. So back to Juderías. I think the Inquisition plays a very important role in what we can consider the conceptualization of the Black Legend, and in particular, the success of Juderías' conceptualization of the Black Legend as the iteration of the concept that was more long-lasting throughout the 20th century. At that time, Black Legend was a term that was used in different contexts. As we know, Pardo Bazán, one of the first intellectuals who spoke of a Spanish Black Legend, in her speech, La España de ayer y hoy, she speaks of a Black Legend and a Golden Legend of Spanish history. They are both exaggerations, they are both imperfect appreciations of the past. And she said that the Golden Legend, the idea of an idealized history, is characterized by the apotheosis of the past and is the most hurtful. And she says this legend, a belated romancero of sorts, was created by the Spanish, la creación colectiva de los españoles. That is Pardo Bazán's idea of Black Legend, Golden Legend. What Juderías does in 1914 is he isolates the Black Legend, the idea of an anti-Spanish legend, which is intrinsically linked to institutions such as the Inquisition that are seen, or he sees as being seen by the foreigners as intrinsically Spanish. He says, when one speaks of the Spanish Inquisition, of Spanish intransigence, of the fanaticism of the Spaniards, in saying that these characters are those with different history, is taking for granted that fanaticism, intransigence, inquisitorial procedures, and the persecutions and expulsions of people of different creeds were phenomena that occurred only and exclusively in our homeland. There having been nowhere acts of cruelty like ours, no more intransigent than those demonstrated by us. This assumption is a starting point of the anti-Spanish legend. So I think it's important of the Inquisition as a theme, and how the Inquisition was revitalized, was written about in the 1910s, is how it provides a context, not so much for the conceptualization of the Black Legend, but for how Juderías conceptualizes and how this idea of the Black Legend as an anti-Spanish legend was a very successful iteration of a concept that at this time was in flux, and which nowadays is questioned. I'm not an expert on the early 20th century. I worked mainly on the 18th and 19th centuries, and some recent books on the 18th century Spain and the 18th century of Spain really question this idea that Spain was seen as a country that was somehow on the outskirts of Europe, or kind of some symbolically expelled from the European modernity. The book by Schaub, La France Espagnole, the Spanish origins of French absolutism, all the book by Checa Beltran on the readings of the Spanish legacy in the 18th century. There's a series of books of recent works that explore the image of Spain in Europe in the 18th century that really question the idea that there was some kind of Spanish exceptionalism. But anyways, we know Juderías isolates that idea of a current of criticism towards Spain, and that becomes a very successful idea throughout the 20th century. So what I want to do is to focus on one particular text, which I think is an example of the actualization of the memory of the Inquisition, and also a context for what Juderías does in the Black Legend. Is the text in question is the Almanaque de la Inquisición, the Almanac of the Inquisition, linked to the periodical El Motín. El Motín was a radical newspaper, a radical anti-clerical newspaper published by José Nackens. I think yesterday the name was mentioned. The Almanac of El Motín was an independent publication from a newspaper that appeared in 1911, at a time when the periodical had been suspended temporarily. El Motín was the object of several prosecutions and several processes, and it had to stop publication at several times in history. And the Almanaque de la Inquisición, which is not exactly an almanac, and we'll go into that in a bit, was mainly written by a collaborator of Nackens called Segismundo Peyordays. Peyordays was a Catholic priest, a conservative, integrist Catholic priest who was initially writing in neo-Catholic reactionary periodicals, and towards the end of his life, he went on to become a collaborator in El Motín, an anti-clerical propagandist. This, which was seen as a very strident change of tune, wasn't really surprising, because both at the beginning of his career and at the end, he is writing against the same thing. He's obsessed with the simony of the higher clergy, with the corruption of the higher clergy via the accumulation, the hoarding of material wealth. That was his preoccupation at the beginning when he's writing in El Urbión and in conservative newspapers, and he carries on with that preoccupation, that obsession, when he writes in El Motín. This Almanaque de la Inquisición, this Almanac of the Inquisition, is part of a series that El Motín publishes called the Biblioteca de la Inquisición. And Nackens, when he presents the Biblioteca de la Inquisición, says that this is a sort of counter, an answer to what he calls the apologia of the Inquisition by enlightened Catholics like Menéndez Pelayo. He's both trying to counteract the traditionalist defense of the Inquisition, the kind of apologia that you can find in Menéndez Pelayo, but also what he calls the, here in this quotation, the reluctance of hegemonic liberalism to talk about the Inquisition. He says that the present generation does not know what the Inquisition was. False liberalism circulated as an axiom that it was in bad taste, that it was cheesy, it was cursy, to talk about these things, to talk about the Inquisition. It has been a happy idea which will produce excellent fruits to empty the ark of the secret of the Spanish Inquisition and to launch to the four winds all these unpublished horrors, which were always kept in the most impenetrable secret. This is, of course, an exaggeration. Llorente had written a history of the Inquisition. It had been translated into Spanish. It had been published with additions by Gerano del Valle in the mid-century. So there were histories of the Inquisition available. What Nackens and El Motín are doing is to disseminate more widely this image of the Inquisition among the readership of anti-clerical Republican publications. Now, the Almanaque de la Inquisición, the Almanac of the Inquisition, is not an almanac in the strict sense. An almanac at this time was, and still is, some surviving almanaques, the Almanaque Zaragozano, mainly a publication that was published once a year, the core of the almanac would be astronomical and astrological predictions for the year, some more practical information like a calendar of festivities, and around the late 18th century, early 19th century, the almanac becomes, to an extent, conflagrated with the literary annual. The almanacs starts including literary creation, poems, articles and sketches of customs and manners, artículos de costumbres, all alongside the traditional contents of astronomical, astrological information. Now, the Almanaque de la Inquisición doesn't really have any of the contents that traditionally we would associate with an almanac. The only exception would be the Efemérides Sangrientas, a sort of on this day-to-day section. And it's not a traditional ephemerides, where it is a chronology of persecution. Yes, a series of dates of the anniversary of persecutions by the Inquisition, of famous trials of the Inquisition, of papal bulls and encyclicals related to the Inquisition. The rest of the contents are really essays, opinion essays on the Inquisition, anti-clerical propaganda against the Inquisition, and towards the second half of the book, a summary of inquisitorial history and inquisitorial procedures. Most of the articles are written by pay or dice. The advertencia and dedication and the foreword are written by Nakens. And there's a disparity between the articles. The first two are, there's an extract here, a very sensationalist. They are very, typical Nakens, rabble-rousing sensationalism. Garfios, martillos, cuñas, pinzas, cuerdas, taladros, all kind of possible tools for torture, completely rambling image of what the adelantos de la mecánica puestos a servicio de la religión, aparatos para cerrar huesos, tools to sew bones, and at the end the Iron Maiden, the Venus of Nuremberg. The idea that there was a coffin that would open and it was full of spikes inside, and the inquisitorial convict would be thrown into the sarcophagus and encased in the spikes. All this gothic, terrible image of inquisitorial tortures are at the beginning in the foreword. Afterwards, in most of the articles, most of the different articles about the Inquisition written by Paradise, he distances himself from the sensationalism of the beginning, and although there is, he dwells on the tortures, the description, the account of inquisitorial tortures is more or less, it follows the historical consensus that at that time Llorente and Genaro del Valle had more or less drawn. So it's not as gothic or as kind of horrific as the beginning. What Paradise insists on, the obsession of Paradise through the Almanaque, is to defend that the Inquisition is alive in several ways. And I'm going to try and be quick when going through the contents of the Almanac. La Inquisición vive y funciona. Funciona la Inquisición, no es un muerto ni está enterrada. The Inquisition is not just a memory, it's alive today in several shapes and guises. First, via the patrimonio eclesiástico. He says that the current wealth of the church, the current architectural patrimony of the church is a remain of the Inquisition, which was a tool for the expropriation of goods. It says, thus the Inquisition wears several disguises, disguises, according to the circumstances, which she uses to steal and to jump over its prey. The idea of the rapacity of the Inquisition, which was already in Adolfo de Castro in the mid-century, and here it becomes an obsession. By this means, the royal patrimony and the ecclesiastical patrimony were formed. And then it says, each stone of the Vatican is a block formed with the bones of the victims. And then in La Inquisición y Dios, another article of the Almanac, the cathedral holds the jewels of the condemned, obtained through crime. Those topazes, rubies, and emeralds belong to the maidens from whose fingers the inquisitor plucked them. On the facets are drawn the portraits of the victims who gaze upon them. Each jewel a victim, temples amassed with the bloods of victims, mortar formed with the ashes of the victims, wealth hoarded through crime. This was written 2 years after the so-called tragic week, the anti-clerical uprising in Barcelona, where convents were sacked and where the mob attacked convents and monasteries. And this is one of the contexts in which the Inquisition, the member of the Inquisition, is mobilized with a current preoccupation in mind. The wealth of the church being a visible, tangible remain of the Inquisition. The Inquisition as a tool for rapacity. Yeah. There's also an Inquisition that is alive in the shape of new inquisitors and new heresies. I haven't translated all the quotes, but in that same article, La Inquisición vive y funciona, the Inquisition lives and works, is alive and well. Periodais speak of that Tribunal del Santo Oficio llamado Defensa Social, the Comités de Defensa Social, the Committees of Social Defense, which were Catholic associations, Catholic groups aimed at political action, which in some cases were responsible for some of the denouncements that El Motín received during its life. So this is another shape of the Inquisition. The Vatican persecution of the modernist clergy. The Almanac often mentions the case of the modernist clergy, such as George Tyrrell, who was persecuted by the Congregation of the Index of the Vatican. All those are also manifestations of the Inquisition. If the committees of social defense, the Vatican, are the new disguises, the new faces of the Inquisition, there are also new heresies. The new heresies are not the Lutherans or the Albigenses, but the anarquistas, antimilitaristas y los revolucionarios, que antes no eran herejes y ahora lo son. Impiedad contra la patria, contra el Estado y contra el orden. So the new heresies are the anarchists, the anti-militarists, and the revolutionaries. And then, what would happen if the monarchy, the current monarchy of Alfonso XIII, celebrated an auto de fe, a modern auto de fe, where ateos such as Ferrer and Protestantes, judíos, all of them were burned at the stake. It would be, again, a negocio formidable, a formidable business by which more cathedrals, more convents could be built, could be edified. Way of mobilizing popular anti-clericalism is there in this association of towards the actual architectonical presence of the church. But it also is interesting because, it's interesting for what I'm doing, which is to study the Inquisition as a literary theme and why the Inquisition had such a lasting presence in literature. One of the things that Periodais does in this almanac is to reflect on the connotations of the word, and how the word Inquisición brings up a series of images and how it can cause horror y espanto. No? He says, and I'm going to read it in Spanish, or I'm going to paraphrase it in English more or less. He says that, leaving aside all the historical arguments about the Inquisition, human instinct, ese instinto ético ha hecho la síntesis total y completa de la Inquisición descrita en la palabra horror. Human instinct, by itself, fills us with horror when we hear the word Inquisition, and in other parts of the almanac, they bring arguments from ideas from psychoanalysis, from the evolutionary philosophy, to justify the idea that the Inquisition is a word that fills us with dread. At some point, he says that the fear of the Inquisition is like the caveman's fear towards the cave bear, the kind of primal fear about something that brings up a very instinctive dread. That natural instinctive fear of the Inquisition had also a popular manifestation in the killing of Arbues. Yeah. Here he speaks of, he tells the murder of Arbues as an example of popular dread of the Inquisition. Yeah. Cuando se piensa en esto y que lo emplean con frecuencia los inquisidores, no solo se justifica el acto de justicia calificado de asesinato de Pedro Arbues, sino que se lamenta que nuestros antepasados no hicieran lo mismo con todos los que intervenían en los procesos, en los tormentos, en los autos de fe. So the killing of Arbues was one of several moments of popular resistance towards the Inquisition and popular resistance towards clericalism. Yeah? So there's a natural dread of the Inquisition, towards clericalism, that manifests itself in several times in history and is part of a natural and national opposition to the Inquisition. I think that, as we saw, as I anticipated earlier, was present as early as in Llorente and Puig-Blanche and some of the liberals of the early 19th century, whose threat when they write a history of the Inquisition is that of showing that there was a national resistance to the Inquisition. Obviously, at that time, national in a patrician sense, at this time, national in a plebeian, in a populist manner. Why is this important when we investigate or when we question the origins of the Juderia's concept of the Black Legend? Because in another of the contexts for how Juderia says Black Legend concept was a successful iteration of the idea, it was that of the revitalization of the Inquisition in the context of what has been called the Praetorian politics around the early 20th century. From the Montjuic trials to the Tragic Week and the trial of Ferrari Guardia, as we know, after the uprising, the upheaval of the Tragic Week, Ferrari Guardia, the anarchist educator, the head of the Escuelas Libres, of the free schools, anarchist-inspired schools that rejected religious education and so on, he was tried as an instigator of the anti-clerical upheaval of the Tragic Week. That trial was widely seen as a militarized trial where there were influence of the clergy in the whole procedure, and how there weren't very clear guarantees. And Luis Cimarro, in a book about the Ferrer trial, he also brings up this idea of the Ferrer trial as a new Inquisition. ¿Yeah? Las ansias de los clericales, correligionarios del señor Ugarte, que no fiando en las decisiones de la magistratura civil, cifran sus aspiraciones jurídicas en el establecimiento de una nueva Inquisición religioso-militar, de que el proceso Ferrer ha sido un primer ensayo. So, this trial of Ferrer as a new religious military inquisition, yeah, the revitalization of the Inquisition, and Ferrer as a victim of the Inquisition in the same way in which when the Montjuic trials a decade before, several anarchists were tried after the Corpus Christi bombings. And these trials, which also were militarized trials, were portrayed as and Inquisition. Yeah, Tarrida Mármol wrote Les Inquisiteurs d'Espagne in Montjuïc, Cuba, and Philippines. This was also echoed in anarchist media. Kropotkin wrote this article, The Smarties in Montjuïc, where he calls the judges of the Montjuïc trials inquisitors, ¿no? Les Inquisiteurs de España. El Almanaque de la Inquisición, the Inquisitorial Almanac, is one of the main sort of examples of this campaign, the militarization of the trials against anarchists as a form of inquisition in Spain. No? Ferrer is seen as the victim of an auto de fe, and El Motín, Naken's periodicals, embraces and encourages an international campaign against the trials. This is El Motín extracting an article published in the Freethinker, an anarchist journal in, I think it's British, about the trials of Montjuïc and the trial of Ferrer and la Escuela Moderna, and how these are a manifestation of las inicuas hazañas de los modernos descendientes de Torquemada, yeah, the modern inheritors, the modern offspring of Torquemada. El precioso volumen titulado Almanaque de la Inquisición, publicado por El Motín, says that la Inquisición vive aún. So the international media echoing the idea that the Inquisition is still alive, linking that with the upheavals of the tragic week, where in the convents where the people enter, they found parrillas para tostar penitentes, the grills where the penitents, the convicts of Inquisition were toasted, were grilled. Yep. So I think this campaign is interesting because some of these ideas go back to Juderías via this foreign gaze that Juderías tries to isolate as the Black Legend. For instance, Juderías questions or rebates the works by G.H. Ward, who wrote a book called The Truth About Spain, where he says that Spain is a swamp where the Inquisition is alive, and the only real education is the one provided by the anarchists. Now, Juderías presents this as an example of foreign European prejudices against Spain. But the truth is that Ward was one of the British Labour politicians who welcomed Tarrida Mármol and other anarchists after the Montjuïc trials. So these ideas that Juderías is saying this is the Europeans looking down on Spain is actually ideas popularized by this anarchist campaign, Spanish anarchist campaign against the militarization of the trials in Montjuïc and after the Tragic Week. So many of the ideas that Juderías presents as Black Legend are actually, I think we could say that they're ideas that revitalize the Spanish Inquisition from movements such as those of republicanism, anarchism, and anti-clericalism. Anti-clericalism being the kind of umbrella for all this. Now, back to El Almanaque de la Inquisición and why Nakens and Payor Days published this text that is not exactly an almanac, because it's more like a collection of essays and a short history of Inquisition, but they call it an almanac. And the almanacs in Spain in the 18th and the 19th centuries, they are texts that, although they become, as the 19th century progresses, they resemble what was the literary annual, a collection, a miscellanea of different literary texts. They always kept a sort of ritual sense. They are published towards the end of the year. They mark the passing of time. Each almanac is linked to a particular year. So why is the Almanaque de la Inquisición this kind of summa of anti-clerical of anti-clericalism against the Inquisition, published as an almanac. One of the things that the articles, and I go back briefly to the contents, sorry, this is not very elegant, but the contents of the almanac, which are different different angles into the Inquisition, into why the Inquisition was this tool for rapacity that exists today and that is intrinsically linked to clericalism today. What the almanac does is to question, in a way, the passing of time. Yeah, it's an almanaque de la Inquisición where this idea that is repeated over and over is that the Inquisition is alive and that we are living in a time that echoes, repeats cyclically the excesses of intolerance in the 16th century. I think this is one of the fragments that that best represents that idea. I'm going to read it in Spanish, but there's a rough English translation underneath. Paradise, which is the article, the author of this quote says, ante un auto de fe, hoy veríamos las mismas fisonomías que se vieron en el siglo XVI. El mismo fraile satisfecho, el mismo alguacil felino, el mismo notario marmóreo, las mismas risotadas de los imbéciles, el mismo temblor y espanto de los delicados, la misma resignación del estupefacto, la misma algazara de los cofrades de San Pedro Mártir. Vive todavía en nosotros la Inquisición, el humor inquisitorial, el tipo inquisidor y el tipo víctima, el miedo proverbial del español, la pasividad con que deja llevarse a la explotación y al suplicio, la insociabilidad, la desconfianza mutua, el recelo de la traición, el prurito del espionaje y del chisme, la maledicencia murmuradora, la indiferencia ante el mal ajeno, la idolatría de la autoridad, el rastrerismo ante el poderoso, el terror ante el clero, la alevosía de la conducta. Todos estos son frutos de la educación aquella. Son tensiones inquisitoriales, son hábitos atávicos que padecemos por herencia. So, this is really, I think, one of the most eloquent parts of the Almanaque, and in a way it sums up some of the obsessions, some of the ideas that Nakens and Paradise are trying to disseminate with this publication. But I think it's also an important chapter in the history of how the Inquisition is revitalized in different moments in the history of ideas, how there's a tradition of thinking about the Inquisition where it appears in different moments. I think one of the keys here is how this is one of the contexts that we could take into account to explain how the concept of Black Legend arose or was conceptualized in a context that was dialectical. Yeah, this is a context which is not only that of Juderías isolating these foreign gaze about Spain, but a context when the Inquisition was being mobilized with different aims and with different ideological explanations. And this is, yeah, I think I'm going to stop here because I think I've reached my time. Sorry, I don't know what I'm doing now. Yeah. I need to stop presenting.
Many thanks for adjusting to the time. I know it's difficult, but we are reaching our limit.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just trying to stop presenting. Stop presenting. Yeah.
Sácalo a lo bruto.
Desenchufa el tiro.
Maybe you are here because I mean we have like 5 minutes question and we have the conclusions. Like, sorry. Juan Pablo, ya estoy liando, es Pablo.
Juan Pablo. De Pablo para la cosa.
Y Xavi, vale.
Maybe we can.
We do all the questions together. Okay, we
how
pack together the question. We make a pack.
Okay. I'm gonna try to formulate it.
You hear from here. You hear the question, Daniel. Escucha la cuestión.
this question is for Pablo, although it's also related with because I'm gonna go a little bit back to the topic of the Black Lady. I'm gonna try to formulate it very briefly, so I don't know if I'm gonna be even able to explain what I mean by this. But I found very interesting that you exposed this moment when supposedly there was a very negative international view of Spain, and then these intellectuals have this idea of vindicating Spain against the people that say that Spain is not civilized. But it's for me it's a bit weird that that you say that they vindicated, not that you say that, but they vindicated the Christian
origins,
the Christian Science, which is a phrase that was used in this journal edited by Ortiz Lara, and the Christian Science was directly opposed to modern science. And finally, they vindicate the Arab science too, and they come to the conclusion that the Arab science was the foundation of scholasticism, that precisely the critics of Spain were saying that one of the main reasons of Spanish decline was precisely scholasticism. So I think that, yes, it was a response to this idea that Spain was not part of civilization, but it was not a response that was really denying that, but in a sense, reinforcing that image.
I have also a question just for Pablo. You say that there was a conservative shift at the end during the Restoration in the Arab scholarship. That I think
even before that.
The Arab scholarship in Spain was born in a period of cultural hegemony of conservatives in the 1840s. So the young historically the first Spanish generation that flourished on the African world was conservatives, most of them. So, what do you mean by a conservative shift? Maybe are you thinking about that more Catholic or national Catholic in this sense? Because you have talked about Menéndez Pelayo as a reference.
Sorry?
Menéndez Pelayo as a reference, but was Menéndez Pelayo so important in restoration in Spain? I mean, because we know that Menéndez Pelayo was very important for 20th century, for the cultural politics of national Catholicism, Francoism. I ask because I'm now following what I've heard to this man's art. Talking me now. It's so important. Menéndez Pelayo, it seems that it was generally ignored, and he was always complaining about it during his life, during the Restoration. And so, is these Orientalists you are studying are representatives of Orientalist thought in this period, or are representatives of this national Catholic
version?
That's the first one. And then the second one, how they reacted to, how they incorporated all the new discourses on race and racialism that studied Joshua Good for the Restoration. It was a moment in which all these new discourses on race were arriving to Spain, and they were supposing a very difficult challenge for Spanish Orientalists that had to deal with the Spanish, with the Arab and Semitic past of Spain. And of course, according to Gude, the hegemonic response to these challenges was to assert that the particularity of the Spanish race, it was a melting pot, it was a mixture. So that's why he talks about the impurity of blood.
Right, impurity of blood.
But of course, too, this mixture was interpreted in very different ways. For instance, from an idea that this mixture, in this mixture, always the dominant race imposes this dominion. For instance, in Valera or other authors, they say the essence of the Spanish race is Aryan, and it's very old. So you can even maintain that there is an Libio, how is it called, the African Spanish, African
Iberian,
race,
Moorish.
and you can argument from brotherhood, of a Moroccan and Spanish
Right.
brotherhood, because there is a Lydian race, very old Aryan, and this was the dominant race. So when other Semitic Oriental races arrived to Spain, they just were elevated by this dominant race, and they were dissoluted into this race. They gave the best that they could give. So Al-Andalus was the Oriental race elevated by the Aryan one, and then, of course, this couldn't go further because that's what they could reach. This was one way for interpreting this. For instance, it's a way that follows Cánovas and Castillo and many imperialist authors or Africanist authors. And then there is another way, another interpretation of the mixture that is more shadowy, that is using these ideas of Gobineau from the middle of the century that are now gaining track all of Europe about the consequences in the long term of this mixture, that this Aryan race dominant, when there is a mixture, when there is a fusion, it degenerates progressively. And this idea is very important for the regenerationists like Joaquin Costa or other authors that say this mixture, this Semitic past, this
feature
is degenerating our race, so we have a problem here.
With that, yeah.
So all these authors, so they incorporated these debates, they did, and how it affected their interpretation of the Semitic past of the peninsula.
Right. Okay, there are very wide questions that I don't know how to answer. I don't even know if I can answer in 20 minutes. I'll try my best to do it in a very, very few minutes. I'm not sure if the vindication that they do is only to foreign visions of Spanish incapacity for intellectual work. It's more directed to the internalizing by Spaniards of these issues, but anyways, the same thing. I'm not very familiar with the word of Ortiz Lara. I mean, I know the figure of Ortiz Lara. I'm not sure he has the same vision of what Catholic science means that to these Arabists, which are receiving ideas also from Joseph Mercier, and the Catholic school in Lovaina, or in Leuven, where he really promotes an integration of Catholic scholars into modern science, and the Catholic scholars should not be in the defense and should participate and should not feel ashamed also of being Catholic. I mean, there is no incompatibility, and they can even, I mean, there were very different attitudes in this movement. I mean, there's a trend and a real movement, and as such it's called, I mean, we have the defense of Catholic science, and they open transnational, I mean, a transnational movement, they open journals, they have conferences, and they try to legitimize the participation of Catholics in modern science in all kind of fields, from the humanities to biology, and to, especially Mercier is very adamant in this issue of working in the hard science, What I wanted to say, definitely is a big issue, and I think it's the less or the most understudied angle, in my opinion, of the study and analysis of modern Orientalism in this period, and I think a very prominent role, and that's why I try to focus on the influence and how this image of a Christian Orient can be instrumentalized to legitimize these kind of studies on the influence of scholasticism. But definitely, I mean, they expressively recognize the influence of Averroes, of Maimonides, and celebrate it to a great extent. I mean, they always say that, but fortunately, we have these figures like Aquinas or Jules that they purify it. And later on, for example, Dante, there is no problem in recognizing you're familiar with the famous work by Miguel Palacios later on, claiming that the Divine Comedy has a great influence, direct influence of Ibn Arabi's eschatological views, and therefore of Muslim eschatological stories. And he said there is no problem, because eventually all these stories comes from the impact of Christian and of Eastern Christian trends into Ibn Arabi. So as Catholics, we shouldn't be ashamed of confessing and analyzing this influence in Dante, for example. The conservative shift. I mean, I'm sure that I haven't satisfied your answer, but we will be able. I don't know how to make it shorter. The conservative shift is also explicitly mentioned, for example, with Vicente de la Fuente. That's why I brought this case. No, like, thank God we have already good Catholics. I mean, of course, there is this element that's conservative in the sense of bringing this Catholic. You're right in pointing that the influence, but I think what he claimed is that he's arguing against Conde for first and foremost, and Conde was not was a francesado, a liberal, and he made a school, or he had influence in many liberal authors during the first half century, and in that sense, it's the influence of Conde and this kind of views on not only Arabists, but in generally in liberal authors. So now we can see that there's a transitioning. I don't know, in his case, he didn't refer to Gallegos, but probably Gallegos is part of the transition. Gallegos can be a sort of figure that navigates also, like Eduardo Saavedra, but always, like, when you mean liberal, it's a very qualified sense of liberal, you know, and can be attached to this liberal conservative. I mean, I think I would put Gallegos in this moderado position, I guess. But I think Menéndez Pelayo, I'm not an expert in Menéndez Pelayo, and I'm really fascinated by this interest in the Semitic legacy, and I want to explore it more deeply. I think he was definitely very important for this school. And this school was the most important school. I mean, you can see the centrality of there, and in the universities, institutions, in publications, abroad, their contacts with foreign scholars. So this is the central school in Orientalism in the Restoration period, no doubt. And the influence of Menéndez Pelayo is huge, and they recognize as such. I mean, it's a seminal influence, and it's directing their agenda. And Menéndez Pelayo by itself, I think it was very important for at least these conservative liberal sectors. I mean, I have no doubt about it, despite that I'm not a big expert on that. But I mean, also you see in the reports that I mentioned by French authors, you know, you have these competing schools in the historiographical arena in Spain. And Menéndez Pelayo is the source for a certain school, and is central for definitely for the Arabists, but not only, for many other scholars. Eventually, he will be, I think, the head of the National Library, the head of the Royal Academy of History. So it's not a minor figure. Perhaps he criticized that it's not being duly acknowledged, but also the fact that they organized this tribute volume to him in 1899 is very significant. It's a tribute to Menéndez Pelayo being 20 years in the professorship. I mean, I don't know if any of you will receive a tribute on a volume when you are 20 years in your professorship. Is very uncommon. And I think also has to deal with this context of after 98 and the intellectual crisis that comes from and these particular sections that want to. But I think that was influential for also helping some conservative intellectuals to partake in these common efforts with other more liberal authors like Altamira and Menéndez Pelayo was participating in the Ateneo de Madrid, and he was criticized by the traditionalists and so on, and he even I don't know if I think he even joined for a brief time the Junta de Estudios, and definitely Miguel Palacios joined the Junta and signed with other conservative scholars a document defending the need for the Junta against conservative and especially traditionalist criticism and Catholic criticism. So in that sense, they play this position, right? And also, I haven't explored in depth the issue of race, which is extremely interesting. And I think Juan Pablo has many more things to say in this regard. I will just say that I haven't seen in all the authors I manage, and there is a constant reference to the Spanish race and all these uses of race. but in very vague terms. I mean, and I haven't seen many reference to Aryan. I mean, they were familiar with these issues of Aryan, Semitic races, and so on. But in the particular works that I read, it's not very prominent. There is a constant reference to the Spanish race as sort of, as you mentioned, something that it can be is very malleable and very. You can make what you want with this issue of race. And there is a reception also in Spain of these issues that the Iberians are related to the Berbers, and there are some French anthropologists that are discussing these issues, and it reaches Spain. But certainly the one that is more important in this sense is Rivera, and I think the most interesting work is that of 1912, in which he claims that the Andalusis were first and foremost Spaniards, and that is because the Muslim invaders were only a few military men that really converted, and they were a minority, and eventually Arab Spain was really racial. It was made from the indigenous population, Islamized. That was Aryan, perhaps. I haven't read in Rivera. I don't remember the term Aryan, at least in this work, but they were Spanish. Might be, but yeah, European, yes, for sure. In the European, I'm not so sure. I have to check. But European, they are, and he presents even the Reconquista. He doesn't talk about the Reconquista, but like the later centuries is a fight between two Spains. One that has been most Islamized, and the most genuine Spain, which is the Catholic, of course. But the others are Spaniards as well, and they never relinquish their language. I mean, one of the arguments he makes is that. Sorry, you want me to finish? I'm very sorry, Javier.
We can continue at lunch.
He put forward only 5 elements, and one is the language. Like Andalusis always continue speaking the Bulgar language of the land. Arabic was a highly literary, and he shows through lyric poetry, which contains a lot of reference to popular languages and so on. And the race never was lost. Even with this I will finish. Like the Abbasids, the Omeyas when they came, they married with local nobles and so on. So even the Caliphate was racially Spanish more than Aryan, in my opinion. I think that it's something that I'm not really an expert on the influence of the Aryanism. Sorry. Difficult questions to answer.
No, I know. I was worried that.
I will also mention the name of my Manuel Gómez Moreno in a text that I already discussed with Juan Pablo. Might interest you. He speaks of an Oriental Spain, which is neither European, neither Semitic. It's something that is very specific, And Spain is always with one half out of Europe.
I have just a really small question for Daniel. You're there, no? Yeah, Idea de Andalucía. About, you mentioned this priest that collaborate with El Motín, and I was really shocked by I mean, for me, it's kind of shocking. And I don't know if there is any reaction in other medias, either anti-clerical or clerical, to criticize the contribution of a clergy, of a priest, to the most famous anti-clerical magazine. And I think also, just thinking, I like how in the culture war of Spain, I mean, in this context of secularization, anti-clericalism, clericalism, I really, really like how Inquisition was again on the table. And thank you also, and I give you Not hearing you. No te escucho.
Ahora, yep. Okay. So it's fascinating how El Motín revitalizes the Inquisition for these culture wars, and how they try to mobilize international opinion in something that at that time was being called black legend by some, but for the anarchists, for the Republicans, it's simply gathering support for criticizing the militarization of some trials. By your days, I've only just started to look into this figure. I mean, I'm not an expert on restoration. I'm more of a 18th, 19th centuries. But yes, he's fascinating. And what he writes when he starts writing in, I think it's El Siglo Futuro and all the other conservative periodicals, and what he says in El Motín is essentially the same. The upper Catalonian clergy is corrupt because of simony, because of the accumulation of wealth, because of its support for Catalanism. He was also against Catalanism from the beginning to the end. So what do we need to do? We need to rage against this, and also we need to create a national Spanish church. They're separated from the Vatican. And he was seen as, yes, a very kind of striking, strident character, but also as coherent in his ideas, in his obsessions. Cansinos Ascens, who has a novel called Bohemia, where he writes about the El Motín, about the redacción in El Motín. He portrays as Pepe Ordeix as this character who is the kind of visible head in this movement towards creating a national Spanish church. Yeah. And it seems very contradictory, but in recent studies about El Motín, there's this recent book by Sanabria, I think, where he characterizes what Nakens and Pepe Ordeix are doing as, he calls it as Republican anti-clerical nationalism. Yeah, so it's a republicanism that is anti-clerical and is Españolista as well in a sense. It's nationalist. That is very coherent with what Pepe Ordeix is doing. Leaving aside all these stridencies, all these, I think he challenged the bishop of Barcelona to a trial by fire. He said, let's jump into a fire and see who becomes who gets burned and who becomes untouched by the fire. He was absolutely bonkers. But he's very coherent in that kind of campaign against simony and against the corruption of the upper clergy.
Maybe we need a biography for him. Thanks, many thanks. We will move to the conclusion. So I will try to be brief. First of all, I would like to thank you all for being here, either in internet or in flesh, in mortal flesh. And many thanks. I think that it has been fruitful. I have learned a lot of things in an egoistic way. For me, it was wonderful. I have learned many things. I have explored researches that I didn't know or not in so extension. Well, we have seen that tolerance and intolerance is something that depends on practical issues. Okay. Goodbye. So tolerance is in a sense, I have some notes I have taken these days. Tolerance is practical, is something practical, not only despotic. I spoke about the despotism of tolerance, because who tolerates cannot tolerate. But I think that the logics of tolerance and intolerance have been shown to be practical. I mean, a practical question. Also, a lesser evil, avoiding civil war, avoiding conflicts, but not for principle, not for good or humanitarian reasons, but unfortunately for other arguments. And it's also a question that has been raised is the connection with nationalism. That's obvious, and the purity of the nationalism. But what has been shown also that is really interesting, we have shown in Xavier Andreu and Gerald de Bogan, is but also another the connection with empire. I mean, the projection of empire. An empire, justifying empire, implies moving ideas such as civilization, progress and humanitarianism in a bad way. So, and that appear against religion. It has also been that it's also a matter of equivalence between past enemies and present enemies. I think that the idea of crusade had changed completely, reinvented in the 19th century, as Ignacio Beca has shown. And it has also many levels of violence. Evelyn Bowers have spoken about the physical violence even of these constructions, but also we have the symbolic violence. And it's also important because in all the speeches we have heard, we don't see, or not regularly see, intolerance as a bad thing, reprehensible. And if we don't see that as a bad thing, how we could expect to install religious freedom or religious of conscience when it's almost really difficult with these national speeches, with these hate speeches. I mean, the combination of the national definition, the Catholic religious national definition, with this hate speech, saw the difficulties of implementing these measures. We have seen also, Juan Pablo has said this, and also we have seen also in Valentin, the idea of the plural, and also in Pablo, plural interpretation of, and Xavier Andreu. This is why I take notes, but plural interpretation of what is tolerance, what is not tolerance, and also yes, we found obviously the idea of reparation, but unfortunately, in the case, I think that it is one of the sole exceptions we have spoken these days, the memoir of Michel Servet, because the goal was no reparation, was not to look for a plural society. So we have seen also this in this nationalism moving all the culture wars. The last example is evident. I mean, how a national theme became also a transnational theme about I was speaking about the trials of Montjuïc and so on. How this local theme was interpreted in a cultural war context in Spain, but on a broader transnational European culture war. But also we see how it is in play, like the ideas of memory and history. Geraldine has tried in her presentation to look for both sides. I mean, it was a goal. My goal when I spoke about the conference to say, yes, I will use memory. Perhaps it's more narrative, but I was speaking of public uses of the past, and I was speaking about always also history, monuments, narratives, romance, and so on. And I think that you have shown, almost everyone, that intolerance, we seek for a scapegoat to justify intolerance. We are not intolerant, but we are forced to, because of the other, because the behavior of the other. Maybe we are not that intolerant, but then yes, it was more something that came from a black cloud, or like the Inquisition. Yes, okay, let's put the blame on the cardinal. And Cardinal Cisneros, no, Xavi has perfectly so. Sorry. We see then in this reflection of history, the romantic nationalism, historicism, and finally the age of commemoration. And I think that it was really interesting. Valentin Suber at first has said, yes, No, when I was asking about Castellion, no? and she said, yeah, but it's an invention of the 19th century. And perhaps, I mean, many of the heritage, the images that we have about religious intolerance are mediated by the conflict of the 19th century. Maybe no, I'm sure about that. And I think that this conference makes sense in this context, because if we understand that the recreation, the invention, the reinvention, you can choose the word you prefer, or maybe combine all of them, take place in this period, we have to play with both timelines, the present and the past, and how they are trying to construct. And also I like how many essays of I don't know how many people have tried, sorry, to reappropriate toleration and to change the meaning. The idea of assimilation was wonderful. I mean, this is a key to understand, because sometimes we approach hoping that someone says we are tolerant and everything is going to be well and let's move on. But not finally, in the end, the consequence are these. No? And I want to also stress that this led us to some contradiction and paradox in realizing that paradox exists. I mean, the paradox is a good thing, I mean, to reflect on the past, on the present, because it sounds, we are not univocal, we are not one thing, we are many things, and we are discussing with many heritage, and we are at the same time being anti and pro and in the middle of all this. We are not coherent. I mean, I'm not coherent. I don't have to expect people to be what I'm not. I'm not coherent. Well, and also I want to stress to end religious stereotypes, and also we have spoken about the memory of intolerance, but also I think that here is also reflections on aggressive secularism. And I think that maybe sometimes when we fix our image in the past, or in the culture war, we see this aggressive secularization sometimes translating violence in. It's normal, because I mean, when you have to fight with a powerful institution, violence became something regular. But I think that it's also to be remember all this aggressive secularization in religious stereotypes, because I remember, and I remember, I have one small story to end. I remember going to German courses in Musa when I was in the research project trying to learn German, and then the German teacher told Arab origin student, and she tried to explain why the Quran was intolerant and sexist, and why she has to leave this thing behind. And I was really shocked. I mean, it was kind of, obviously it's an exception, or I hope that it's an exception in Europe. But sometimes we have these stereotypes. We judge, and I end with badness, no, and saying we are intolerant, we are all intolerant. But I think that is also a reflection that we have to make. We don't have to concentrate just in one kind. I mean, in the public sphere, in the discourses, in the speeches, we don't have to focus on one kind of violence or one goal of this violence. Neither anti-Semitism, nor anti-Muslims, nor anti-Catholics, because maybe it's interesting to integrate all of them, not to show that it's okay that we are intolerant, but to arrive to the opposite conclusion. That because of that, we have to move on and try to find better ways to understand out between ourselves and make perhaps a better world. But that's something we cannot do. That's ending. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. No, thanks. Yeah.
No.
That's okay.
I was saying that it's a good conclusion.
Yeah. I mean, because they say that we are here, we are researchers, and our work doesn't that doesn't have any impact on the media. But perhaps, I mean, claiming that it is possible to remember all the intolerance, all the violence together, maybe we arrive to a better conclusion. Many